The hospital parking lot went dead quiet the moment Officer Craig Dillard slammed the young nurse against the side of the ambulance bay wall, his forearm across her collarbone, his face 2 inches from hers. "You just ended your career," he hissed, "for a man who doesn't even know his own name." She didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't beg. She looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved, steady, cold, and completely unafraid. 3 hours later, 47 motorcycles rolled into Danner Falls, Wyoming in tight military formation, engines shaking the glass in every storefront window on Main Street. They came to a stop outside Callaway Ridge Medical Center like a wall of iron. Every rider wore veteran insignia. Every single one of them was looking for the same person. And the people inside the hospital who had thought they'd won, the ones who'd cheered when the nurse was escorted out, began to understand very slowly that nobody was the most catastrophic word they had ever chosen. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit follow and stay with me until the end of this story. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most Tuesdays did at Callaway Ridge Medical Center. Nurses punched in before 6. The overnight staff handed off charts with the particular exhaustion of people who had been awake since the previous afternoon. The fluorescent lights in the east wing flickered the way they always did. Maintenance had been promising to fix it for 4 months. The coffee in the break room was burnt. The heating system made its familiar grinding sound every time it cycled on. Ordinary. Predictable. The specific kind of mundane that healthcare workers stopped noticing after their first year. Nora Vass was 32 years old, 5'6", and had worked the medical surgical floor at Callaway Ridge for 3 years. Before that, she'd spent 6 years as an Army combat medic. 2 deployments, one of them to a forward operating base, where the nearest surgeon was 40 minutes away by helicopter. And the difference between a patient living or dying was almost entirely what she did in the first 4 minutes. She had a small scar along her left jaw from a vehicle accident during her second deployment that she'd stopped explaining to people a long time ago. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight. She spoke in the flat, precise sentences of someone trained to communicate under pressure. She did not particularly like small talk. Her coworkers liked her well enough. In the cautious way people tend to like someone who is clearly more competent than average and not trying to make friends out of it. She was reliable. She didn't miss shifts. She caught things other nurses missed. A subtle change in breathing pattern, an irregularity in a chart that didn't match symptoms, a patient who said they were fine but wasn't. She also didn't laugh at the administrator jokes, didn't attend the optional team-building lunches, and had a habit of looking at her supervising physicians with an expression that made clear she was assessing whether they were right rather than assuming they were. This had not made her universally popular with the people who ran the hospital. Specifically, it had made her a problem for Harlan Metz. Harlan Metz was the chief operating officer of Callaway Ridge, not the CEO, not a physician, but the man who controlled schedules, staffing decisions, budget allocations, and the particular administrative machinery that could make a nurse's life either livable or a slow grind toward resignation. He was 51, wore the same 3 suit combinations on rotation, and had built a very comfortable career on the principle that hospitals ran better when staff stayed in their defined lanes and didn't ask unnecessary questions. He'd been COO for 9 years. He had a plaque on his wall from the State Hospital Association. He had the CEO's ear and the medical director's patience. He did not like Nora Vass. The feeling was close to mutual, though Nora expressed it mostly through silence and correctly filed paperwork, rather than anything she could be formally disciplined for. The incident that had been building for 3 years reached its breaking point on that particular Tuesday because of a man nobody inside the hospital particularly wanted to deal with. His name, as Nora would later piece together from fragments, was Raymond Coble. He was somewhere between 55 and 65, though it was genuinely difficult to tell. He had the look of a man who had spent extended time outdoors without choosing to. Weathered, thinned down, wearing a canvas jacket that had been good quality once. He'd been brought to the ambulance bay just after 7 in the morning by a county transit driver who'd found him collapsed near the bus depot on the east side of Danner Falls. The driver had called it in as a possible overdose, which Nora suspected immediately was wrong. She was doing an intake assessment near the bay doors when the transit driver pulled up, and she got to the man before anyone else had a chance to redirect the situation. His breathing was shallow, but rhythmically wrong in a specific way she recognized. His skin had the gray undertone that went with internal bleeding rather than substance impairment. When she checked his arms for track marks and found none, she was already mentally categorizing this differently. "Sir, can you hear me? I need you to stay with me." He opened his eyes, brown, clouded with pain but tracking. He tried to say something and couldn't manage it. "Don't try to talk. Just squeeze my hand if you understand me." He squeezed. She moved fast. She called for a gurney, rattled off her initial assessment to the charge nurse, and got him inside. It took 4 minutes to get a blood pressure reading, and when it came back, she understood the gray skin. His pressure was low enough to indicate internal hemorrhage. The question was where and how significant. This was the point where the morning stopped being ordinary. The charge nurse on duty was Patricia Good, who had been working at Callaway Ridge for 14 years and had strong opinions about resource allocation. She came to the bay doorway and looked at the situation with the expression Nora had seen before on Patricia's face. The calculation of inconvenience versus necessity. "What have we got?" "Hypotension, possible internal bleed. He needs imaging." "Is he insured?" Nora looked up from her assessment. "I'm sorry?" "I'm asking if he has coverage. We need to know before we commit the imaging suite." "Patricia." Nora kept her voice level, which took a specific kind of effort. "His systolic is 84. If this is what I think it is, we have a window. Protocol says we stabilize first and deal with billing later. That hasn't changed." Patricia made the face of someone who knew she was technically wrong but resented it. She left. The imaging suite was freed up. Nora got Raymond Cobble into the system under uncompensated emergency care, the form she'd filled out enough times to know by memory, and moved him through. The scan confirmed a splenic laceration. Not catastrophic, not yet, but heading toward catastrophic if left alone. The attending physician on duty, a solid emergency medicine doc named Dr. Yusuf Adara, looked at the images and ordered a surgical consult. Nora stayed with the patient through the first 2 hours of stabilization. She got a name from him when his condition leveled enough for him to speak. Raymond Cobble. She got fragments between his labored answers. Danner Falls wasn't where he lived. He'd been passing through. He'd been in some kind of altercation the previous night. He didn't want police involved, and he'd spent time in the Army a long time ago. That last part she filed away without comment. She was 3 hours into her shift, running on the specific autopilot of someone managing 4 other patients simultaneously, when Harlan Metz appeared on the floor. This was unusual. Metz generally stayed in the administrative wing. When he came to the floor, it was never to help. He found Nora at the nurse's station updating Raymond Cobble's chart. "Vass, my office. Now." She finished the entry she was in the middle of. "I'm in the middle of patient documentation." "It'll wait 30 seconds. She saved the file and followed him, already aware this was going to be something she wasn't going to like. His office smelled like recycled air and the specific cologne of a man who wanted to project authority. He closed the door and turned to face her without sitting down, which meant he wanted this to feel like a confrontation. "The patient you admitted this morning, Raymond Cobble." "Yes." "Uncompensated care admission." "Correct." "He presented as an emergency and met criteria." "He had no ID, no insurance, no address. We can't even verify that name." "He was hemorrhaging." "Nora." Metz used her first name the way people do when they want to sound like they're being reasonable. "I'm not disputing that you followed emergency protocol. I'm raising a concern about a pattern. This is the 4th uncompensated admission you've initiated in 6 weeks. Because 4 patients in 6 weeks were emergencies. 3 of them were found to be stable enough to have been redirected, after stabilization, not before." He looked at her with the particular patience of someone who had already decided the outcome of the conversation and was just waiting for the performance of it to conclude. "There's a process for these cases. You keep bypassing it." "The process," Nora said, "is that emergency care gets provided and then we figure out billing. I'm not redirecting hemorrhaging patients to wait for financial verification." "Nobody is asking you to redirect hemorrhaging patients. That's exactly what Patricia Good was doing this morning." Something shifted in his expression. She'd named it too specifically. Patricia was following standard intake protocol. Patricia asked me if he had insurance before I could get his blood pressure. Metz folded his hands on his desk. I think you've developed some assumptions about how this facility operates that we need to address. I think we probably see this differently, Nora said. I think, Metz said, that you might want to consider whether this is the right position for you. She looked at him steadily. Is that a formal warning? It's a conversation. She left his office and went back to work. The day ground forward. Raymond Cobble went to surgery at 11:40. Dr. Adara called it a successful repair. Nora checked in when she could between her other patients, tracking the post-op notes, flagging two things in his recovery chart that she thought needed closer monitoring. She was at the end of her shift, 6 o'clock, 12 hours in, when it unraveled. She'd gone out to the ambulance bay to drop off a piece of equipment that had been left out and needed to go back to the transport team. She was walking back inside when the black and white SUV from the Danner Falls Police Department pulled in, and Officer Craig Dillard got out. She knew Dillard by name and by reputation. Most of the hospital staff did. He was 44, thick through the shoulders, had been with the department for 16 years. He had the specific swagger of a man who had never once doubted whether the rules applied to him. He'd brought patients into the emergency department before. Nora had seen him 3 or 4 times in the bay, and each time there had been something slightly off about his manner, the way he talked over nurses, the way he used his body in doorways, the way he said things like, "I'm just trying to protect the community," in a tone that made clear community had a narrower definition in his head than it did in the dictionary. He was looking for Raymond Cobble. Nora stepped into his path without quite blocking it. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for a patient admitted this morning. Male, 50s, canvas jacket." "Patients don't get disclosed without authorization." Dillard looked at her with the particular contempt of a man accustomed to nurses stepping aside. "I'm a police officer." "I know. You still need patient authorization or a warrant for medical information." "I don't need a lecture from—" He caught himself, just barely. "I have reason to believe this individual is connected to an incident from last night." "Then you can go through our patient liaison and get the proper documentation." He stared at her for a moment. Then he smiled, which was somehow worse than the contempt. "You're that nurse, aren't you? The one Metz has been talking about." She didn't answer. "You know what your problem is?" He took a half step closer. "You don't know when something isn't your business. Patient privacy is my business." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're cataloging something. "I'll be back." He left. Nora watched the SUV pull out and stood in the bay for a moment, running the encounter back through her head. The way he'd asked about the jacket, the way he'd known to ask about Tuesday morning specifically without her giving him a time frame. He wasn't there to conduct an investigation into last night. He already knew where Raymond Cobble had ended up. He'd been looking for him specifically. She went back inside and checked the post-op floor. Raymond Cobble was gone. Not discharged. Not transferred. His chart showed no discharge order. His room showed the bed stripped, the IV stand empty, the monitor off. No paperwork. No signature. She went to the nurse's station on that floor and asked the evening charge nurse what had happened. The charge nurse looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Metz authorized a transfer." "To where?" I was told it was an internal transfer to the outpatient observation wing." It wasn't. Nora checked. Raymond Cobble was not in outpatient observation, not in any wing of the building, not in the system as currently admitted. He had been moved somewhere, without a discharge order, without physician sign-off from Dr. Adara, without Nora being notified. She went looking for Metz. She found him in the corridor outside the administrative suite, talking in a low voice with Patricia Good, and a man Nora didn't recognize. Tall, early 50s, business casual, the specific blank-faced professionalism of a man who worked in insurance or compliance or some adjacent gray zone. All 3 of them stopped talking when they saw her coming. "Where is my patient?" she said. Metz's expression went careful. "Was? Raymond Cobble was post-operative 6 hours ago. He is not in any wing of this building. Nobody discharged him. Where is he?" "He was transferred to a transitional care facility." "Without Dr. Adara's sign-off?" "Dr. Adara was consulted." I just called Dr. Adara. He didn't sign off on anything. He didn't know Cobble had been moved. Metz's jaw tightened. The stranger beside him said nothing. Patricia Good studied the floor. The patient, Metz said slowly, was moved as part of a routine administrative decision about resource allocation. You are not the attending physician on this case. Your involvement in this patient's treatment ended when your shift ended. My shift ended 10 minutes ago, and this is not a resource allocation decision. This is moving a post-op patient without medical authorization. I'm going to need you to lower your voice. I'm going to need you to tell me where he is. The stranger cleared his throat. Metz looked at him, then back at Nora, and she saw something pass through his expression that she'd seen in other situations. Not quite guilt, but the particular look of someone performing a calculation. You're on administrative leave effective immediately, Metz said. She went very still. On what grounds? Insubordination and violation of facility protocols. You'll be notified in writing. You're suspending me for asking about a missing patient. I'm suspending you for a documented pattern of insubordination that culminated today in multiple violations of chain of command procedure. He'd rehearsed this, she could tell. Security will walk you out. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You should think very carefully about what you've done with that man. Collect your things. She was at her locker when Patricia Good appeared in the doorway. Nora kept her back to her, pulling out her jacket, her personal water bottle, the small framed photo she kept on the top shelf. For what it's worth, Patricia started. It isn't, Nora said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Patricia left. The security guard who walked her out was a young man named Deke, who had always been decent to her, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable with the assignment. He didn't say anything. She didn't make it worse for him by making a scene. She walked out through the main lobby, past the nurses' station where two of her colleagues watched from behind the desk with the careful expressions of people deciding whether to acknowledge what was happening or pretend they hadn't seen it. She made it to the parking lot, found her truck, got in. She sat there for exactly 60 seconds, hands on the wheel, engine off. Then Craig Dillard's patrol SUV pulled up beside her and he stepped out. She got out of the truck because she knew from experience that staying seated when a cop wanted a confrontation could go wrong in ways that staying on your feet tended not to. He came around the front of her truck, looked at the box of her things in her hands. You have a good day? She didn't answer. I heard there was some personnel restructuring happening. He was smiling. Sometimes that's how it goes. You push too hard on something that's not your business. Eventually people notice. Where is he? The smile stayed, but the eyes went flat. I don't know what you're talking about. Raymond Cobble, where did Metz move him? Lady, he said, the most important thing you could do right now is get in your truck and go home and start thinking about where else you might want to work. She looked at him directly. Did you hurt him? Something crossed his face then. Not guilt. She didn't think he'd arrived at guilt, but something adjacent to alarm, as if she'd said something that revealed she knew more than she should. He moved fast. One hand came up and caught her by the upper arm, turned her, pressed her side into the ambulance bay wall. Not the wall, she registered. The side of the parked ambulance, metal and solid. His forearm came across her collarbone, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to pin. You need to understand something, he said, low and close. That man is a nobody. Nobody knows him. Nobody's looking for him. And you just threw your career away for him. Whatever you think you saw tonight, you saw nothing. You understood nothing. And if you go digging around in this, you're going to find something a lot worse than a suspension. She felt the metal behind her, felt the pressure of his arm, measured his stance out of pure habit, the habit of 6 years doing a job where physical awareness of the space around you was the difference between situations that stayed manageable and situations that didn't. She said nothing. He held it for another 2 seconds. Then he stepped back, straightened his jacket. Have a good evening, he said. She watched him walk back to his SUV, watched it pull out of the lot. She stood in the ambulance bay for a moment in the early October cold, her ribs aching slightly where the metal had dug in, her box of belongings tucked under her arm. A passing nurse saw her from the lobby doors and looked away. She got in her truck. She drove to the Danner Falls Public Library, which was open until 8 on Tuesdays, found a terminal in the back, and spent 45 minutes doing something she was methodical and careful about, building a record. Everything she remembered, time-stamped as best she could from memory. Every exchange with Metz, every word from the intake floor, what Patricia had said, what she had seen in Raymond Cobble's chart, the timeline of his disappearance, and what Dillard had said in the parking lot. She sent it to her personal email. Then she sent it to a second account she'd set up years ago and never used, because the part of her brain that had been trained in forward operating bases where things went sideways had always understood that documentation was what separated the people who survived institutional machinery from the people it buried. Then she sat back and thought. Raymond Cobble, Army veteran, passing through Danner Falls. Got into something the night before. She was less and less convinced this was a random incident, given how specifically Dillard had known to look for him. Post-op. Moved out of the hospital without authorization. A man nobody was looking for, except somebody was looking for him, or had already found him. She picked up her phone. Dr. Adar had given her his personal number once during a complicated overnight case, back when she was still someone whose judgment he trusted, which he still did, she was fairly certain, regardless of what Metz had told him. She texted him, kept it brief. Did you authorize Coble's discharge or transfer today? He replied in 4 minutes. No, I've been trying to reach Metz since 6:30. Nobody's telling me anything. What is going on? She stared at the message. Then her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. Area code she didn't know. She looked at it for a moment, then answered. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, with the specific flat effect of military discipline on the backside of retirement. Is this Nora Vass? Yes. My name is Marcus Webb. I was given your contact information by someone at the Veterans Outreach Office in Danner Falls who said you were the nurse who admitted Raymond Cobble this morning. Who are you? A pause. Raymond Cobble isn't just a homeless veteran passing through your city. I need to know where he is, and I need to know it tonight. Nora leaned forward in her library chair. Through the window in front of her, the parking lot of the library was empty and still. Somewhere in Danner Falls, in a location she didn't know, a post-op patient with a repaired splenic laceration had been moved out of a hospital without a doctor's authorization by a COO who had just suspended her for asking about it. And a police officer had shoved her against a vehicle and told her she'd seen nothing. Tell me who you are first, she said, and then tell me what Raymond Cobble's real name is, because I don't think that's it. The line was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then Marcus Webb said, his name is Eldon Cross. He's a retired Special Operations Master Sergeant, and he went missing from a federal protective custody arrangement 2 days ago, which means someone knew exactly where to find him, and someone at that hospital made sure he didn't stay safe when he got there. Outside, a truck turned into the parking lot, and its headlights swept the window. For a moment, the light hit the glass directly, and Nora couldn't see anything beyond it, only the white glare and her own reflection staring back at her. She looked like she was already working the problem. Because she was. What do you mean, protective custody? Nora kept her voice low, even though she was alone in the back corner of the library. Who had him? U.S. Marshals in coordination with the Army Inspector General's office. Marcus Webb spoke the way people speak when they're disciplined enough to stay calm, but angry enough that the calm is costing them something. Eldon Cross is the primary witness in an active federal investigation. He's been cooperating for 4 months. 2 days ago, his handler stopped checking in. By the time we located the handler, Cross was gone. What happened to the handler? A pause that answered the question without answering it. Nora closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. What is the investigation into? I can't give you details over an unsecured line. What I need from you right now is everything you observed. His condition when he came in, who he spoke with, who came asking about him, and specifically, who authorized the transfer out of the hospital. She told him. All of it. The intake, Metz, Patricia Good, Dillard's visit to the Bay, the missing chart entries, the confrontation in the parking lot. She recited it the same way she'd typed it into the library terminal 40 minutes ago. In order, specific, without interpretation layered on top of fact. Webb didn't interrupt. She could hear him moving at some point, a door closing, the ambient sound shifting around him. When she finished, he said, The officer who approached you in the parking lot. Dillard. You said he came to the hospital before Metz made the call to move Cross, out. Yes, by about 2 hours. Did Metz and Dillard appear to know each other? She thought back. The conversation she'd interrupted in the corridor. The stranger with the blank face. There was a third person with Metz when I confronted him about the missing patient. I didn't recognize him. Not hospital staff. Business dress, older. He didn't say anything the whole time. Can you describe him? She did. Webb went quiet for a moment. Miss Vass, I need you to go somewhere that isn't your home tonight. Is there somewhere you can stay? She hadn't expected that. The specific directness of it landed differently than a vague warning would have. Why? Because you asked questions in front of people who have been moving very carefully for a long time, and you are now someone who can connect Dillard to the hospital to the transfer. That makes you inconvenient. She sat with that. Where's Cross? Do you know yet? We have a general area. We're working on it. He had a splenic repair 6 hours ago. He cannot be moved aggressively without risking the repair site. He needs rest, monitoring, antibiotics. If they've transported him to somewhere without medical oversight, I understand. I don't think you do, she said. Not unkindly, but clearly. A laceration repair like his is not stable in the way a discharge paper makes it sound. The sutures hold under normal conditions. Stress, physical exertion, a rough vehicle ride, any of those can cause a rebleed. If that happens without someone there who knows what they're looking at, he dies in about 40 minutes. Webb was quiet. So find him quickly, Nora said. She hung up. Looked at the library terminal in front of her, the blinking cursor. Looked at the box of her belongings on the table beside her, the framed photo face down, her water bottle, the spare set of compression gloves she kept in her locker during long shifts. She thought about Webb's warning, thought about going home to her apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Sutter Lane with a deadbolt that was good but not exceptional, and a neighbor on the right side who worked nights. Then she thought about Eldon Cross, wherever he was, with a 6-hour-old surgical repair and no one who understood what they were looking at. She picked up her box and left. She drove to her friend Jazz Moreau's place. Jazz was a paramedic who worked county EMS, lived 20 minutes outside the city in a house that sat back from the road behind a stand of lodgepole pines. They'd known each other since Nora's first year at Callaway Ridge, when Jazz had brought in a bad accident case, and Nora had been the one to catch the pneumothorax the ER doc almost missed. Jazz was the kind of person who, when called at 9 in the evening and told a situation was complicated and could she stay over, said, "Yeah, of course, I'll leave the porch light on without asking for more detail first." Nora drove the long way, doubled back once, did the specific route awareness she hadn't needed in 3 years and fell back into without thinking, which told her something about what her body had already decided about the level of the situation. Jazz was awake when she got there, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug and a county EMS training manual she'd been annotating. She took one look at Nora's face and closed the manual. How bad? I don't know yet, Nora said, which was honest. She slept 3 hours. Light and interrupted, but sleep. At 4 in the morning, she gave up and sat at Jazz's kitchen table with her phone, working through what she knew and what she needed to know. Webb hadn't called back. She didn't call him. She didn't have a secure line, and after the conversation in the library, she was conscious of the limits of what she should be doing on a traceable device. What she had: a name, Eldon Cross, a connection between Dillard and Metz that had resulted in a post-op patient being moved illegally, a suspended nursing license she couldn't practice on, a federal investigator who told her to stay somewhere safe and then gone quiet. What she didn't have: Cross's location, any understanding of what the federal investigation was actually into, any sense of how high up this went, or whether Dillard and Metz were the top of the chain or just the part of the chain that had made contact with her. She made a list, not on her phone, on a piece of paper she found in Jazz's junk drawer, with a pen that almost ran out halfway through. She was methodical about it, old habit. In the field, when the situation was chaotic and the resources were limited and the pressure was at the kind of level that made people's thinking go sideways, the thing that kept you functional was breaking it into components. What do you know? What do you need? What can you actually do right now? At 5:45, her phone rang. Number she didn't recognize. Different area code from Webb's. She answered. Nora Vass? A woman's voice, clipped and precise. Yes. I'm Special Agent Dana Pruitt. I work with Marcus Webb on the Cross matter. We need to meet in person. I can be in Danner Falls by 8. You found him? A half-second pause. We found where he was taken. Ms. Vass, I have to tell you that the situation has developed significantly overnight. I need you to sit tight and not contact anyone at Callaway Ridge until we've spoken. I'm suspended. I wasn't planning to. I mean anyone. Colleagues, physicians, anyone with a connection to the facility. She thought about Dr. Adar's text. She'd answered it last night with "can't explain yet. Don't sign any transfer documents." She hoped that had been vague enough. Okay, she said. Is there somewhere we can meet that isn't your home address or the hospital? She gave Pruitt the address of a diner on Route 9 she'd driven past 100 times. Open at 6. Enough ambient noise that a conversation wouldn't carry. Dana Pruitt was younger than her voice, mid-30s in a dark jacket over a gray shirt, with the particular posture of someone who'd learned to take up less physical space in rooms where she needed people to underestimate her. She carried a hard-sided case and sat down across from Nora in the back booth without looking around the room, which meant she'd already assessed it when she came in. Nora liked her immediately, in the specific way she liked people who moved like they knew what they were doing. Pruitt ordered coffee, didn't open the case, looked at Nora directly. What do you know about Eldon Cross? I know what Webb told me last night. Primary witness in a federal investigation, former special operations, protective custody that broke down. What do you know about what the investigation is into? Nothing. Webb said unsecured line. Pruitt nodded. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle, which Nora read as a habit rather than nervousness. I'm going to tell you some of this because you're already in it, whether you want to be or not, and because we need your help. The investigation concerns the diversion of federal healthcare funds designated for veteran services in a 5-county region of Wyoming. We're talking about a coordinated scheme that's been running for approximately 6 years. Grants, reimbursements, supplemental care allocations, money that was supposed to fund treatment for low-income veterans in this region was being rerouted. Systematically. Nora kept her expression still. How much money? Current estimate is north of $4 million. Could be higher. Cross was the finance officer for a veterans outreach program that fed into Callaway Ridge's grant reimbursement system. He found the irregularities, tried to report internally, got pushed out. Eventually, he came to us. And the investigation connects to the hospital. Callaway Ridge has been one of the primary conduits, which means someone inside the hospital's administrative structure has been in on it. The financial pipeline runs through billing records that don't match actual services provided. Someone has been filing for veteran care services that either weren't delivered or were delivered but the reimbursement was being split, part going to the intended program, part going somewhere else. Nora thought about Harlan Metz, his office with the plaque from the State Hospital Association, the 9 years he'd been COO. The particular comfort of a man who'd built something that ran the way he wanted it to run and didn't want nurses asking inconvenient questions about resource allocation. Metz, she said. Pruitt's expression didn't change. We believe there are multiple parties involved. At this stage, we're not confirming names to people outside the investigation. But Dillard is connected. Craig Dillard has been flagged in our investigation for approximately 8 months. His role, as best we understand it, has been enforcement, keeping the wrong people from getting too close. Cross had been flagged as a problem before he ever came to us. There were incidents, minor harassment, a vehicle stop that turned ugly. We believe the incident the night before he ended up in your ER was not random. Nora sat with this. The transit driver who'd found Cross at the bus depot. The altercation the night before. Cross not wanting police involved. He wasn't passing through. He was trying to get somewhere. We think he was trying to reach a contact in Danner Falls who could help him get a message out. He'd been moved from his original protective location 2 weeks prior because we had a concern about the security of that location. The new arrangement was less formal. That turned out to be a mistake. Where is he now? Pruitt looked at her for a moment. He's alive. He's in critical condition. The word critical landed like something cold. The repair site? Re-bled during transport. We found him approximately 90 miles east of Danner Falls, in a storage facility. He was conscious when we found him. He'd been there approximately 14 hours. 14 hours with a re-bleeding splenic repair. Nora did the math involuntarily. The fact that he was alive meant either the rebleed had been slow or something had tamped it down enough to buy time. Neither scenario was stable. He needs surgery again. He's in emergency transport now, military medical facility. It was determined a civilian hospital in the region isn't secure. Smart. She meant it. What do you need from me? Pruitt opened the hard case for the first time. Inside, in a padded organizer, were several printed documents and a small external drive. We need your testimony. We need your documented account of what happened at Callaway Ridge yesterday. Everything from the moment Cobble, Cross, was admitted to your suspension to Dillard's behavior in the parking lot. We need it in a formal statement. I can do that. We also need you to be prepared for the fact that this is going to get complicated publicly before it gets simpler. We're moving toward arrest warrants. That process takes time even when the evidence is strong. In the meantime, Callaway Ridge is going to continue operating. Metz is still COO. Dillard is still carrying a badge. I'm aware. There's a risk that your suspension becomes something more permanent. They can't fire you for cooperating with a federal investigation, not legally, but they can find other grounds. Documentation of protocols you supposedly violated, retroactive performance concerns. It happens. I know how institutional retaliation works, Nora said. I've seen it. Pruitt looked at her with a slight recalibration in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but an acknowledgement of something. Webb mentioned your background. Then you know this isn't the most complicated situation I've been in. No, Pruitt said. I don't imagine it is. She spent the morning giving her formal statement at a location Pruitt had arranged. Not a government building, a rented office space on the second floor of a professional building on the west side of Danner Falls, nondescript enough to not draw attention. A second agent, a quiet man named Richter, who said almost nothing and took precise notes, sat in for the statement. Nora went through it methodically. Dates, times, quotes, where she could remember exact language, approximate language where she couldn't. She corrected herself twice when she caught herself speculating instead of reporting. Richter noted both corrections without comment. At one point, Pruitt asked about Nora's Army record, and Nora explained it briefly. Combat medic, 2 deployments, a commendation she didn't elaborate on, separation from service at 26 to complete her nursing degree. Pruitt nodded. Didn't make a thing of it. By noon, she was done. Her lower back ached from the chair. She hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. She went to a sandwich place around the corner and ate mechanically, standing at the counter, watching the street through the window. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, a voicemail from Dr. Adara asking her to call when she could, and a text from Jazz asking if she was okay. She replied to Jazz first. I'm okay. Don't know when I'll be back. She didn't return the unknown number. She was thinking about what Pruitt had said about the timeline to arrest warrants. Takes time even when the evidence is strong. She understood this. She also understood that Eldon Cross was alive because of luck and a slow rebleed, and that the people who'd moved him out of a hospital and left him in a storage facility had done so because they were scared. Scared people move faster than investigators. She was walking back toward the parking lot when a car she didn't recognize pulled up slowly beside her, and the passenger window came down. The man behind the wheel was in his late 60s, white-haired, wearing a flannel jacket and a Vietnam veteran cap. He looked at her steadily. Are you the nurse from Callaway Ridge? She stopped. Who's asking? My name's Bernard Teal. I knew Eldon Cross from the 75th Rangers 40 years ago. His voice was the kind of quiet that came from years of keeping strong feelings behind a practical face. Word got to us last night about what happened. About the hospital, the cop, all of it. He paused. We're already here. 22 of us. More coming by tomorrow morning. She looked at him for a moment. What does that mean? You're here. It means we drove through the night and were parked at the KOA campground off Route 9. And by tomorrow, we're going to have between 40 and 50 members of the Mountain States Veterans Riding Association present in Danner Falls. He held her gaze. We're not here to cause problems. We're here because one of ours was left in a storage building to die. We're here because the people who did it are still working at a hospital and still carrying a badge. And we're here because someone inside that hospital stood up for him when it wasn't her job to. She looked at the veteran cap, the weathered hands on the steering wheel, the careful, controlled stillness of a man trying to contain something large enough to require containment. You can't interfere with an active investigation, she said. We're not planning to. We're planning to be visible. He let a beat pass. Sometimes visible is enough. She thought about Pruitt's timeline, the arrest warrants that took time, the COO still running a hospital, the officer still carrying a badge, and a $4 million fraud scheme that had been running for 6 years because nobody had been visible enough to make it stop. I need you to coordinate with a federal agent named Pruitt before you do anything, she said. I mean that seriously. If you act without coordination, you give them an excuse to shift the story. Bernard Teal nodded once. Fair. I'll give you her number. She did. He took it, looked at it, looked back at her. 40 years ago, he said, Eldon Cross pulled 2 men out of a situation that should have killed all 3 of them. The men he pulled out, one of them is riding with us from Billings right now, and one of them died 8 years ago from something else entirely. But his son is riding, too. He said it simply, without performance, just fact laid flat. She stood in the parking lot in the October cold and felt something shift in the weight of the situation. The federal case was one thing. The legal structure, the warrants, the process. This was something else. This was 40 years of loyalty pulling onto a highway and pointing itself at a town of 30,000 people. Make sure Pruitt knows you're here before tomorrow, she said. Already texted her. She hadn't given him Pruitt's number yet. She blinked. He allowed himself the smallest smile. We have our own channels, Ms. Vass. She went back to Jazz's that afternoon. She needed to think, and Jazz's property, the pines, the quiet, the particular rural silence that a town person would call emptiness, and a person who'd spent time in truly empty places knew was actually full of small sounds, helped her think in a way that Danner Falls proper didn't. She sat on the back steps with her notebook and worked through the timeline she knew. 6 years of diverted funding. Callaway Ridge as a conduit. Metz almost certainly involved in the financial structure. Dillard as the enforcement arm, making sure the wrong people got pushed out, harassed, or worse. Cross as the witness who'd been smart enough to document and patient enough to cooperate with investigators before he was silenced. And someone had gotten to the protective custody arrangement, which meant someone had access to information that should have been compartmentalized, which meant the investigation's exposure went somewhere she didn't yet have visibility into. She was still on the steps when her phone buzzed with a text from Pruitt. Need you available tomorrow morning. Things are moving faster than expected. Stay off social media and don't give statements to press if contacted. She wrote back. Why faster? Pruitt's reply took 4 minutes. Cross regained consciousness at the military facility. He's been talking for 2 hours. He had documentation on him we didn't know about. Physical documents sewn into the jacket lining. Nora stared at the message, the canvas jacket the transit driver had described, the jacket Cross had been wearing when he was brought into the ambulance bay. Where's the jacket now? She wrote. Pruitt's reply was immediate. That's the question. Nora stood up from the step. She walked back through Jazz's kitchen and into the spare room where her box of belongings was sitting on the floor, the same box she'd carried out of the hospital last night. She'd been methodical, even in the shock of the suspension. She'd taken everything from her locker. She pulled the box open. Water bottle, compression gloves, the framed photo, a spare phone charger, a folded spare set of scrubs from the bottom of the locker she'd forgotten was there. When Cross had come in, he'd been put in Bay 2. His personal effects, the jacket, his shoes, the small canvas bag the transit driver said he'd had, would have been bagged in the receiving process. Standard intake protocol. Everything bagged, tagged, and sent to the patient belongings secure room on the ground floor. But his chart had shown his belongings had been transferred with him, which meant whoever had moved him had taken the belongings too. She called Pruitt. The jacket went with him, Nora said the moment Pruitt picked up. It would have been in the patient belongings bag. Whoever coordinated the transfer from the hospital's end would have made sure the belongings moved with the patient. They were thorough enough to pull the chart entries. They would have gotten the belongings bag too. We know. We recovered the jacket with Cross. The documents were intact. Pruitt paused. They didn't know about the lining. What's in them? Financial records, handwritten ledger entries, and what appear to be copies of internal billing documents. Going back 5 years. He's been carrying them for the last 3 months. 5 years of ledger entries in a jacket lining. Nora thought about an aging veteran, out of protective custody, traveling by bus, knowing he was being looked for and still holding on to the documents because they were the only leverage he had. He's going to be okay, she said. It wasn't a question, exactly. The surgeons are optimistic. Pruitt's voice had a controlled quality that Nora recognized as someone giving information while managing their own relief at giving it. He came through the second procedure. He'll be monitored closely. What happens tomorrow? A long pause. Tomorrow, we have a problem. Nora waited. Dr. Adara filed a formal complaint with the state medical board this morning about the unauthorized transfer. He documented everything he could access, which wasn't much, but he filed it. Metz found out. He's now moving to shore up the administrative record, having staff sign statements about the transfer, building a paper trail that makes it look authorized. He's working fast. If he gets enough signatures, it muddies the chain of evidence for the hospital side of the investigation. He's asking hospital staff to falsify records. He's asking them to sign statements that are carefully worded enough to be technically defensible. Not the same thing legally, but effective. We've been tracking it in real time. We have informants inside the building. And you can't move yet. Not yet. The warrant process has a specific sequence. We have what we need from Cross's documents, but executing warrants at an active hospital requires coordination that can't be rushed without risk to the case. Pruitt stopped, then said something she probably hadn't planned to say. I have 37 hours before I can execute. A lot can happen in 37 hours. Nora sat with that number. 37 hours. Metz building his false paper trail. Dillard still in his patrol car. The Veterans Riding Association camped at the KOA off Route 9 with more riders coming through the night. And somewhere in a military medical facility, Eldon Cross, who had sewn documents into his jacket lining and ridden a bus toward a city where maybe someone would finally listen, coming out of his second surgery with the particular tenacity of a man who'd decided he wasn't done yet. Is there anything you need me to do tomorrow? Nora asked. Pruitt said, Be ready to move when I call, and get some sleep if you can. She tried. She didn't manage much. At 3 a.m, she was awake again, sitting in the dark in Jazz's spare room, when her phone lit up with a text from a number she'd seen once before, Bernard Teals. 47 riders as of an hour ago, more coming. We'll be at the hospital at 9. She typed back quickly. Pruitt approved? His reply came in seconds. Yes. We stay on public property. No confrontation. Visible only. A pause, then. She asked us to go at 9 specifically. Something about timing. Nora stared at the ceiling. She thought about Pruitt's 37 hours and something about timing and 47 motorcycles parked outside a hospital in the October morning. She thought she was beginning to understand what Pruitt was doing. Then her phone rang. Not a text. A call. The ringtone that meant a number she'd never seen before. She picked up. The voice on the other end wasn't Webb, wasn't Pruitt. It was a man, older, unhurried. Ms. Vass? My name is Colonel Arthur Denning, Army Inspector General's office. I apologize for the hour. It's fine, she said, because it was. I've been briefed on your involvement in this matter. I've also reviewed your service record, which I should have done before anyone asked you to walk into this blind, and I want to apologize for that as well. We moved fast when Cross surfaced, and we made some decisions about who needed to know what that, in retrospect, underestimated you. She didn't say anything, because he was clearly still going somewhere. I'm calling because tomorrow is going to be a complicated day, he said. And I want you to know that when it becomes complicated, you are not going to be handling it alone. The investigation is broader than what Pruitt was able to share with you. There are individuals at Callaway Ridge other than Metz who have been implicated. and there are federal charges being prepared that extend beyond the hospital into the police department. How far into the police department? Far enough, he said carefully, that by tomorrow afternoon, Craig Dillard will have significantly more pressing concerns than a suspended nurse who asked the wrong questions. She pressed the heel of her hand against the side of her head, thinking, "What do you need me to do tomorrow?" "I need you to be at Callaway Ridge at 9:15, he said. "In the lobby. Not as staff. You're suspended, and I'm not asking you to violate that. Just present. As a private citizen who has reason to be there." He paused. "Can you do that?" She thought about the ambulance bay wall and Dillard's forearm across her collarbone. She thought about the empty room where Eldon Cross's bed had been. She thought about Metz's rehearsed speech and Patricia Good looking at the floor. "Yes," she said. "Good." Denning's voice carried something in it she recognized after a moment as the particular regard of someone who'd read a file and respected what was in it. "I'll see you there." The line went quiet. Nora set the phone on the nightstand and lay back and looked at the ceiling of Jazz's spare room, where the moonlight was coming through the gap in the curtain in a narrow white line across the plasterboard. She thought about 37 hours becoming 9 hours, about timing, about what Pruitt had arranged and what Denning had just told her, and what 47 motorcycle engines were going to sound like on a Tuesday morning in a town of 30,000 people. She was still working through it when her phone lit up one more time. Not a call, not a text from any of the numbers she'd been dealing with all day, but an email notification. Her personal account. The forwarded documentation she'd sent herself from the library terminal the night before bounced now to a third address as an automatic failsafe she'd set up years ago. Safe. Intact. She closed her eyes. And in a supply room on the third floor of Callaway Ridge Medical Center, Harlan Metz was at that moment standing over a desk with a stack of papers and a list of names, making phone calls to people who didn't fully understand what they were signing, building the case for his own innocence, one signature at a time, working through the night, certain that by morning he would have enough cover to survive whatever was coming. He did not know that Cross was awake. He did not know what was in the jacket lining. He did not know what the morning had already decided. But Nora did, or enough of it. She was dressed by 6:15, out of Jazz's house by 6:40, with a coffee she drank standing in the driveway while the pines dripped from the overnight frost. Jazz had woken up when she heard movement in the kitchen and come out in her work jacket, already half ready for her own shift. "You're going back there," Jazz said. "Not as staff." "But you're going." Nora looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Yes." Jazz nodded slowly. "You want me to drive you?" "I need you to go to work and not be involved in this. If it goes wrong, I don't want you tangled in it. And if it goes right," Nora handed back the empty cup, "then I'll buy you dinner." She drove into Danner Falls on Route 9 and heard them before she saw them. The motorcycles were already staging at the KOA, idling in loose groups near the exit, the specific layered rumble of 40-some engines at low throttle vibrating through the truck's floorboards before she'd even made the turn. She passed slow enough to see Bernard Teal at the front of the column, his white hair under a dark helmet, his face composed. He didn't look like a man who'd slept much either. She kept driving. She parked 2 blocks from Callaway Ridge on a side street and walked the rest of the way, hands in her jacket pockets, watching the building as she came up on it. It looked exactly the same as it always did. The glass and concrete face, the parking structure to the east, the ambulance bay around the side where 2 days ago she'd had Dillard's forearm across her collarbone, staff arriving for morning shift, a dietary delivery truck backed up to the loading dock, ordinary Tuesday morning infrastructure. She got to the main entrance at 9:08 and pushed through the doors. The lobby of Callaway Ridge was the specific kind of functional that hospital administrators mistook for welcoming. A volunteer at an information desk, a cluster of seats near the window, bad art on the walls. The morning shift had brought the building alive. She recognized 2 nurses crossing toward the elevators. They saw her. One of them looked away. The other held eye contact for a half-second, which was its own kind of statement. She found a chair near the east wall with a clear sightline to both the main entrance and the elevator bank. She sat. She was a private citizen waiting in a lobby. Nothing about that was actionable. At 9:11, her phone buzzed. Pruitt. In position. Do not approach Metz. Do not engage Dillard if he's in the building. Stay visible and stay put. She sent back a thumbs up and put the phone face down on her knee. At 9:14, she heard them. The sound built from outside like weather arriving. The low rolling thunder of engines in formation growing louder until it was fully present, not just background sound, but something the whole building could feel. A few people in the lobby stopped moving. The volunteer at the information desk stood up involuntarily, craning toward the windows. Two people came out of a hallway off the east corridor and looked at each other. Through the lobby windows, Nora watched 47 motorcycles pull into the main approach of Callaway Ridge Medical Center in two parallel columns and stop. They spread themselves across the visitor parking area with the specific deliberateness of people who had decided exactly what they wanted the image to look like. Veterans' insignia visible on every jacket, not moving, not shouting, not blocking anything, just there. The lobby went strange and quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when the people inside them are suddenly uncertain about what the rules are. Then Harlan Metz came off the elevator. He'd been there since before 7, she guessed. He had the look of a man who'd been working through the night and had convinced himself he'd won. He was carrying a folder, striding with the particular momentum of someone who had things to execute. He got to the lobby, looked toward the windows, and stopped. He stood there for a full 4 seconds, which was long enough for Nora to watch the various calculations move across his face. Then he saw her. Their eyes met across 30 feet of lobby. She didn't move, didn't smile, didn't look away. She just sat there in her civilian jacket with her phone on her knee, and she watched him understand that whatever he'd been planning for this morning was not going to go the way he'd planned it. He looked back at the motorcycles, looked at her, looked at the folder in his hands. He went to the security desk and said something to the guard, who picked up a phone. That was when the front doors opened and Dana Pruitt walked in, followed by Richter and 2 additional agents Nora hadn't met, and behind them, Colonel Arthur Denning in uniform. Metz saw the uniform and the folder dropped 3 inches in his grip. Denning didn't rush. He was 61, silver-haired, and had the physical presence of a man who'd spent decades being the person that rooms adjusted to rather than the other way around. He walked to the center of the lobby, looked around at once as though confirming something, and turned to Pruitt with a short nod. Pruitt went directly to Metz. Nora was close enough to hear it. Pruitt didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. Harlan Metz. I'm Special Agent Dana Pruitt, Federal Criminal Investigative Service. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of federal fraud, misappropriation of grant funds, and obstruction of justice. I also have warrants to execute a search of this facility's financial records and administrative offices. She held out the documents in a way that was almost courteous. I need you to come with me now. Metz looked at the warrant, looked at Denning, looked at Pruitt. I want my attorney, he said. His voice had gone flat. Whatever he'd been planning, whatever signatures he'd collected last night, he'd already done the math and understood it wasn't enough. Absolutely, Pruitt said. You can call from our office. Please come with me. He went. Not gracefully. His body language was stiff with the furious dignity of a man who still hadn't decided whether to perform innocence or outrage. But he went. The lobby was very still. Then it broke open. 2 nurses near the elevator were talking in low, urgent voices. The volunteer had abandoned the information desk entirely. A physician Nora recognized from the internal medicine floor came out of the corridor, took in the scene, and immediately turned around and went back the way he'd come. Richter and one of the other agents were moving toward the administrative hallway with a physical hard drive evidence case. Denning was speaking with the hospital's legal representative, a woman named Gail Sorensen, who'd come down from the 6th floor looking like someone who'd just been told the floor was collapsing under her. Nora stood up from her chair. Denning noticed and made his way across the lobby toward her. Up close, he was exactly what he'd sounded like on the phone, contained and direct, and choosing words with the precision of someone who understood their weight. Ms. Vass. Colonel, thank you for being here. He said it the way people say things they actually mean, which is differently from the way they say things they're supposed to mean. I need to ask you one more thing this morning, and then you can step back from this. Ask it. There's a staff member on the 3rd floor. One of the nurses Metz contacted last night about signing a statement. We believe she didn't sign. She called our tip line at 2 in the morning, which is partly why things accelerated on the warrant timeline. He paused. She's going to be frightened. She's been at this hospital for 11 years and she just watched her COO get arrested in the lobby. She's going to need someone who knows what the inside of that place looks like to talk to her before the agents go up. Nora understood immediately. You want me to go first? I want you to go with one of my people. You wouldn't be conducting the interview. Just present to make it less institutional. He acknowledged this with a slight dip of his head. Yes. What floor? 3. Her name is Sandra Polk. Nora knew Sandra Polk, had worked with her for a year before Sandra moved to the 3rd floor. She was 53, had 2 kids in high school, and had always been the nurse who kept cookies in her locker for bad days. She was not someone built for the situation she'd apparently found herself in, but she'd made the call to the tip line at 2 in the morning, which meant she was braver than she looked. Let's go, Nora said. Pop-pum. Sandra Polk was in the supply room at the end of the 3rd floor corridor, which was where Nora might have looked for her anyway. People in institutional crisis tend to gravitate toward small rooms. She was sitting on an overturned supply crate with her phone in her lap, and the specific expression of someone waiting for consequences they'd decided they could live with. When she saw Nora, something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Safe enough recognition. I heard the lobby, Sandra said. Through the floor, almost. They came with warrants, Nora said. Metz is in custody. Sandra looked at the agent who'd come up with Nora, a young woman named Tess who had the good instinct to stay near the doorway rather than crowding the room. Then she looked back at Nora. He called me at 11:30 last night, Sandra said. Metz. Told me he needed me to sign a statement about a patient transfer. Said it was routine documentation. I asked him to send it over so I could read it. She stopped. The wording was, it said the transfer had been physician authorized, that Dr. Adara had approved it verbally and the paperwork was being processed. But you knew that wasn't true. I was on the floor when Adara was trying to reach Metz about it. He was upset. I've never seen Dr. Adara that upset. She pressed her lips together. I've been here 11 years. I've never been asked to sign something that I knew wasn't true. I know, Nora said. I didn't sign it. I know that too. Sandra looked at her hands. I don't know what happens to me now, whether I still have a job, whether... You called the tip line, Nora said. That puts you on the right side of this. Everything else gets sorted out, but that part is settled. It wasn't a comfort that fixed everything. Nothing did, and Nora wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But Sandra exhaled, and some of the tight hold in her shoulders released a fraction. Agent Tess stepped forward. Ms. Polk, I know this morning has been a lot. Would you be willing to walk me through the call with Mr. Metz? We can do it here or somewhere quieter. Your choice. Sandra looked at Nora once more. Go ahead, Nora said. You've already done the hard part. She left them there and walked back down the corridor toward the elevator. On the 3rd floor, the morning had gone strange. Nurses clustered at the station in low-voiced groups. A charge nurse she didn't recognize doing his best to project normalcy, while clearly running on crisis adrenaline. 3 more federal agents were moving through the administrative offices at the far end of the floor. Through the window that looked out over the main parking approach, Nora could see the motorcycles still there, 47 of them, not moving. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. On the 2nd floor landing, she stopped. Craig Dillard was coming up. He was in uniform, which meant this was a professional visit, and he was moving fast enough that he almost ran into her before he pulled up short. They stood on the landing 6 feet apart, and the particular small space of the stairwell made everything tighter than it would have been in the open. His face went through 3 things quickly: surprise, calculation, and then something that had been contempt before but was now starting to look more like fear dressed as contempt, which was different. What are you doing in this building? He said. Waiting in a lobby. I'm a private citizen. You're a suspended employee. Suspension doesn't prohibit me from the building. She watched him. Are you here to see Metz? Something moved in his face. Where is he? Federal custody. She said it levelly. They executed warrants about 20 minutes ago. I don't know where they took him. Dillard looked at the wall. She could see him thinking. The calculation she'd seen men do in bad situations when they were assessing how much they'd known going in versus how much had been known about them. He reached for his phone. "I wouldn't make that call from inside this building," she said. He looked at her sharply. "I'm not your enemy," she said, which was not quite true, but was tactically sound. "I'm telling you that this building has been under federal surveillance for 2 days. Whatever call you're thinking about making, do the math." His hand stopped. He stared at her. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed, short and ugly. "You think you won something here. I think a man who got left in a storage building with a surgical wound is alive, and the people who put him there are going to answer for it. You don't know anything about what happened. I know enough." She held his gaze. "And so does Eldon Cross. He's been talking for 16 hours. The name hit Dillard the way she'd intended it to, like a weight dropped from height. His jaw moved. His hand tightened on the phone and then released. "Cross," he said low. "They told me." He stopped himself, but she'd seen it. The slip of someone who'd been told something about Cross that had turned out to be wrong, told by someone he'd trusted, believed, built his position on. "Who told you what about him?" she said. He looked at her, then past her, at the stairwell wall. The calculation was over. She could see it in his face. The moment when a man stops deciding whether to fight and starts deciding whether to run. He turned and went back down the stairs. She pulled out her phone and texted Pruitt 2 words. "Dillard. Leaving." Pruitt's reply was 4 seconds. "We have him." She stood in the stairwell another moment. Somewhere below she heard the lobby doors. Somewhere outside, through the concrete of the building, she could feel more than hear the motorcycles. Still present, still waiting, the low vibration of it working up through the stairwell walls. She went down. The lobby had changed in the 20 minutes she'd been upstairs. More agents. A hospital administrator she didn't know talking in a rapid, strained voice to Denning's aide. 2 local news vans in the parking lot. She could see them through the windows, setting up with their cameras pointed at the sea of parked motorcycles. A reporter holding a mic and looking at the riders with the expression of someone who'd arrived at a story they hadn't been sent to cover. Denning was near the information desk. He saw her come down and walked over. "Dillard's in custody," he said quietly. "They picked him up at the south exit." "He slipped," she said, "in the stairwell. He said something about Cross, that he'd been told something about Cross's condition or status that turned out to be wrong. Someone fed him information to keep him compliant." Denning's expression tightened fractionally. "That's consistent with what Cross told us. There's a third party, someone who was coordinating between Metz and Dillard without being directly visible in either man's documentation. We haven't identified who yet." She looked at him. "That's why the warrants couldn't wait." The third party knew Cross had surfaced, which means they knew about the investigation, which means the longer we waited, the more risk of evidence destruction from a direction we couldn't see. She processed that. Metz and Dillard hadn't been the ceiling of this. They'd been 2 floors of a building, and somewhere above them was a level that neither of them had given up yet, maybe because they didn't have the full picture of it themselves. The scheme had run for 6 years because the architecture was designed that way. Visible people at the operational level. Someone else holding the actual structure together from a distance. "Cross knows who it is," she said. "He does," Denning said. "He's also still in post-surgical recovery, and there is a limit to how hard we can push that conversation today. But he's..." She didn't finish the sentence, because the east corridor door opened and a nurse she didn't know came running into the lobby at a pace that was specifically wrong. Not the controlled urgency of a professional response, but the raw, unchecked speed of someone who'd lost their clinical composure entirely. "Is there a doctor?" The nurse was scanning the lobby, face pale, voice cracking at the top. "Someone needs to... There's a patient in the corridor, he just collapsed. We need..." Nora was moving before the sentence was done. Not because she was staff, not because she had any authority to act. Because there was a person on the floor somewhere in this building, and she was the most qualified person in the lobby, suspended or not, and that was the only math that mattered. She pushed through the east corridor door and ran. The corridor stretched ahead of her, and 30 feet down she saw the cluster of people. Two aides, a physician she recognized as Dr. Farouk from orthopedics, all of them leaning over a figure on the floor. The figure was elderly, thin, dressed in civilian clothes rather than a gown, and when she got close enough to see his face, she recognized the particular gray undertone she'd seen once before. She knew that face. She knew it from a photograph in a federal briefing document she'd seen on Pruitt's table. She knew it from the Veterans Outreach records she'd reviewed. She knew it from the name Colonel Denning had said, and from 16 hours of a man talking through surgical recovery to federal investigators. Eldon Cross. He had discharged himself from the military medical facility. He had traveled 90 miles, post-operative, on his own, and somehow he had walked into Callaway Ridge Medical Center and gotten 30 feet into the East Corridor before his body said no more. Doctor. Farouk was checking his pulse. She could see from his expression it was there, but wrong. Suture, she said, dropping to her knees. He had a splenic repair, secondary repair, 16 hours ago. If he's re-bled, who are you? Farouk demanded. I'm the nurse who did his first intake. What's his pressure? One of the aides had a cuff on Cross's arm already. The number she read out made Nora's jaw tighten. Get me a gurney and get Dr. Adara on the phone right now, she said. She pressed 2 fingers to Cross's neck, counted, lifted his shirt to look at the incision site. The skin around it was wrong, tight and discolored in the specific way she'd been afraid of. Cross opened his eyes, clouded, slow, but tracking. Easy, she said. I've got you. You're at Callaway Ridge. His mouth moved. She leaned in. I need... His voice was barely there. I need to tell them. Pruitt. There's a name. There's one more name. I didn't get to finish. Okay, she said. Okay. You can tell them. But you have to stay with me right now. Do you understand? His hand came up and gripped her wrist. Not weakly. Vas, he said. He knew her name. Someone had told him her name. Don't let them... He didn't finish. His grip went slack. The aide called out the blood pressure again, and it was lower, and somewhere behind Nora she could hear running footsteps, and a gurney coming, and Dr. Farouk saying something on his phone in a rapid, controlled voice. She kept her hands exactly where they needed to be and looked up at the corridor ceiling for 1 second, not because it helped anything, but because humans need 1 second sometimes, even when they can't afford it. Then she went back to work. The gurney arrived in under 2 minutes, which was fast enough to matter. She helped transfer Cross onto it with the controlled speed of someone who understood that the wrong movement at the wrong moment with a compromised repair site was not recoverable. Doctor. Farouk was on the phone with the OR the entire time, reading out the numbers the aide was calling, his voice staying flat and professional in the way physicians learn to do when the situation is bad enough that panic would cost more than it expressed. Second look laparotomy, Nora said, moving alongside the gurney. The first repair was 16 hours ago at a military facility. He's had 2 procedures on this spleen. If it's re-bled again... I know, Farouk said. He wasn't dismissive. He'd taken the information in and was already working with it. Is there documentation from the military facility? Not with him. Pruitt. Agent Pruitt has contact with the facility. She can get operative notes transferred in under an hour. Get her to do it now. Nora already had her phone out. They pushed through the double doors toward the surgical prep corridor. She couldn't go past the doors. Suspended or not, her authorization stopped there, and Farouk hadn't said anything to keep her in. She stopped at the threshold and watched the gurney go, watched the doors close, and stood in the corridor with her phone in her hand and the specific draining sensation of having done everything she could do and not knowing if it was enough. She called Pruitt. Cross is in surgical prep at Callaway Ridge. He left the military facility on his own. I don't know how. He needs his operative notes from the first 2 procedures transferred here immediately. Dr. Farouk is the attending. Pruitt went quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which Nora read as the sound of extreme effort at self-control. He what? He's in the building. He was conscious in the corridor. He said there was a name, one more name, someone in the investigation he hadn't finished giving you. Then he lost consciousness. She kept her voice level. The operative notes, please. I'm calling now. Pruitt hung up. Nora stood at the corridor doors and breathed. In through the nose, out slow. The old field reset. Not because it fixed anything physiologically in the way people who'd never needed it sometimes imagined, but because rhythm was the first thing to go under sustained stress and the first thing worth recovering. Colonel Denning appeared at the end of the corridor. He'd seen the gurney clearly. His face was carrying the particular controlled tension of a man assembling new information into an existing structure and not liking the shape it was making. "Tell me," he said. She did. All of it. Finding Cross on the corridor floor, his condition, what Farouk had ordered, the 2 words Cross had managed before he went under. One more name. Denning turned and walked a short distance away, which was how she knew he needed a moment. He came back in 7 seconds. "He told us 3 names in his initial statement," Denning said quietly. "Metz, Dillard, and a financial intermediary we've been tracking through the transaction records. The intermediary has been harder to place. The money moved through a structure that was designed to keep hands clean." He paused. "If there's a 4th name, it changes the geometry of this considerably." "What do you mean?" "I mean the 3 names we have are operational. People who handled the money, provided cover, maintained pressure on the ground. A 4th name, one Cross felt he hadn't finished giving us, could be the person who designed the structure. The one nobody touches because nobody can see them clearly enough to reach." She processed this. 6 years. A $4 million diversion running through a hospital's billing system without detection for 6 years didn't happen because 2 men got careless. It happened because the architecture was professionally built. "Who has the sophistication to build that?" she said. Denning looked at her steadily. Someone who understood both the federal grant system and the hospital's internal controls well enough to exploit both simultaneously. He let a beat pass. "We've been looking at one possibility for about 6 weeks. We couldn't move on it without corroboration. And Cross is the corroboration. If he survives to give it..." She looked at the corridor doors. The surgical suite at Callaway Ridge was on the 4th floor, which meant the next 2 hours were spent in the specific purgatory of a waiting area where the light was bad and the chairs were worse, and the information came in drips. Pruitt appeared at some point, having coordinated the transfer of Cross's operative notes from the military facility. It had taken 40 minutes, not an hour, because she'd called someone who had the authority to make it happen fast. She sat in the waiting area for a while without speaking, and then left to continue coordinating the evidence execution downstairs. What Nora heard, in fragments from Farouk's aide, and from the brief update Farouk himself gave at the 90-minute mark, was this. The rebleed had been slower than she'd feared. Not slow enough to be safe, but slow enough that they'd caught it before the full cascade. The spleen, which had taken 2 prior interventions, was not salvageable. They removed it. A splenectomy in a 60-something-year-old man who'd already been through 2 abdominal procedures in 48 hours was not a minor thing, but it was survivable. And Farouk said the word stable at the 2-hour mark with the carefully neutral tone of a physician who meant it as fact rather than reassurance. She sat back in the plastic chair and felt the last 48 hours settle into her body all at once. Her lower back. Her jaw, which she apparently had been clenching without realizing. Her right hand, which had been gripping things, phones, gurneys, corridor walls, with enough sustained force that her fingers had gone partially numb. She was a private citizen in a hospital waiting area who had just assisted in emergency triage during a suspension that was still technically active. She was aware that this was legally complicated. She was also aware that Eldon Cross's blood pressure had been recovering when they got him to the OR, and that the operative notes Pruitt had transferred had given Farouk exactly the information he needed to make the right call quickly, and that both of those facts existed because she had been standing in the right place and had done the right things in the right order. She was too tired to feel anything straightforward about any of it. Dr. Adara found her in the waiting area at the 3-hour mark. He came in looking like a man who'd been through a sustained unpleasantness and was reaching the point of needing to say something to someone he trusted. He sat down beside her. "I heard what you did this morning," he said. "In the corridor. Farouk did the work. Farouk told me you had the clinical picture faster than anyone in that hallway." She didn't answer. "The statements Metz was collecting last night," Adara said. "He called me too." She looked at him. He said the transfer had been documented with my verbal authorization, that I'd simply forgotten to file the paperwork. He said it the way people say things that insulted their intelligence at the time and still do in retrospect. I told him he could take his paperwork and he stopped. I told him I'd be filing my own report in the morning, which I did. The state board complaint. Yes. He rubbed the side of his face. I've been at this hospital for 7 years. I've known Metz for 6 of them. I knew he was politically motivated and difficult. I didn't know he was doing this. He gestured vaguely at the building around them, which now had federal agents in 3 of its floors. I feel like an idiot. You filed the report, she said. That's not nothing. It accelerated things? A little. Enough. He nodded, sat with it. What happens now? To the hospital? To the department? I don't know. The board will have to respond. There'll be an interim administrative structure while the investigation proceeds. She thought about it. The hospital isn't the problem. The hospital is where the problem was housed. Small distinction for the people who work here. I know. He stood up. I'm going to put in a formal request to the board to reinstate you with full back pay pending the investigation's resolution. I'd have done it yesterday if I'd known where you were. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. You caught a splenic laceration the transit driver called an overdose. You held the room in the corridor this morning without any legal right to be there and probably saved Cross's life for the 3rd time. He looked at her steadily. Yes, I do. He left. She sat alone for another few minutes. Then she went downstairs. The lobby of Callaway Ridge had transformed into something that felt like the aftermath of a storm. The structural damage not immediately visible, but the residue everywhere. Federal agents moving in and out with hard drives and boxed files. The hospital's general counsel on her phone in a corner, looking like a woman who had not signed up for this. 2 of the news cameras had moved from the parking lot to the lobby entrance, which security was managing with the strained politeness of people who knew they couldn't physically block a public story. Outside, the motorcycles were still there. Bernard Teal was standing near the front entrance when Nora came through. Not inside on the steps, technically not impeding anything. He looked at her when she pushed through the doors, and his expression asked the question without him saying it. He's in surgery, she said. They think he'll make it. Teal turned away from her for a moment. His hand came up and gripped the railing, and she looked at the white-haired back of a man managing something large and private and gave him the space to do it. When he turned back, his face was composed again. The writers want to stay until there's more news. That's up to you and Pruitt. You're not in anyone's way. The reporters want to talk to us. What do you want to say? He thought about it. That we came because someone took care of one of ours when it wasn't her job to, and that we'll keep coming back until the people who hurt him are accountable. He paused. Is that going to cause a problem? Say exactly that, Nora said, word for word. A reporter had been angling toward them. Nora saw the camera tracking and stepped back inside before it found her. She wasn't ready to be on camera. She also understood that Teal and his writers were a more useful story right now than she was. 47 veterans standing peaceable and immovable outside a hospital while federal agents executed warrants inside was the kind of image that required no editorial intervention to communicate what it meant. She found Pruitt near the administrative corridor, standing outside the door of what had been Metz's office, watching agents work the room inside. Cross is stable? Nora said. Pruitt closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something in her face was a fraction less taut. Farouk called me. Yes. The name he tried to give me in the corridor, do you have any leads? We have theories. Cross's initial 3 names gave us the operational structure, the financial intermediary Shakit. A man named Gary Soule. We picked him up at his home in Laramie about an hour ago. He's not talking yet, but he will. She said he will without particular drama, which was more convincing than if she'd said it with emphasis. The 4th name, we're working on the assumption that it's someone at the administrative level above Metz, someone with access to the original grant framework. The grants that funded the veteran care programs at this hospital, who administered those originally? Pruitt looked at her. What are you thinking? Metz has been COO for 9 years. The scheme has been running for 6. which means it started 3 years into his tenure. Something changed. Some new access, some new relationship, some new channel opened up. She kept her voice measured. He didn't build the diversion structure on his own. Someone showed him the opening. We've been working backward through the grant administration records. The federal side is clean. The money left the source correctly every time. The diversion happened on the receiving end, at the hospital's intake level. But to know exactly how to exploit that intake process, you'd need someone who audited it first, Nora said. Pruitt went very still. An auditor, or a compliance consultant, someone who came in, assessed the billing infrastructure officially, wrote a report that told you exactly where the controls were weak, and then knew how to use that report for something other than what it was commissioned for. Pruitt was already reaching for her phone. The hospital's compliance audit records. Who conducted the last external audit? That I can't tell you, but Metz would have commissioned it, or whoever commissioned it would have recommended Metz for the COO position in exchange for access. She thought it through. The compliance record would be in the administrative files, the agents in the office. Pruitt was already walking toward the office, phone to her ear, calling Richter. Nora followed to the doorway. The office was organized chaos. Files pulled, drawers open, agents working through the physical and digital records simultaneously. Richter was at the desk with a laptop, and Pruitt got to him and said something low and direct. Richter started typing. 3 minutes. 4. Richter said, "Got it. External compliance review, 6 years ago. Conducted by a firm called Aldgate Consulting Group." He read off an address. "Primary auditor on record." He stopped. Pruitt looked at the screen, her jaw set. "Who is it?" Nora said from the doorway. Pruitt turned to look at her with an expression she hadn't worn through any of the last 2 days. Not quite surprised, because people who worked these cases trained themselves out of surprise, but the particular tightening of someone who has just confirmed something they'd hoped wasn't true. "His name is Warren Gall," Pruitt said. "He's a compliance consultant. He also serves on the board of directors of this hospital. Has for the last 5 years. The board. The body that would now be responsible for interim governance of Callaway Ridge in Metz's absence. The body that had the authority to reinstate suspended staff, restructure administration, make every decision about what Callaway Ridge looked like going forward. The body that currently included the man who had likely designed the entire scheme. "He's been here this morning," Nora said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen suits coming in and out of the boardroom on the second floor. The normal administrative response to a crisis, board members being notified, gathering. Pruitt was already on the phone to Denning. Nora stepped back from the doorway and looked down the corridor. Somewhere in this building, in a conference room, or a boardroom, or someone's office, Warren Gall was watching the investigation unfold from the inside, watching the people below him get arrested, watching the agents work through files, watching everything collapse toward him one layer at a time, and deciding whether to run or stay and perform innocence. She pulled out her phone and texted Denning directly. "Gall may be in the building. Board convened this morning for emergency session. He'd have been notified." Denning's reply was immediate. "Which floor is the boardroom?" "Second. End of the east wing." A pause. Then, "Stay where you are." She stayed for about 40 seconds. Then she walked to the stairwell. The second floor east corridor was quiet compared to the lobby and the administrative floor, the kind of quiet that meant people were behind closed doors conducting business they considered private. She came through the stairwell door and moved along the corridor without rushing, because hurrying in a corridor draws attention, and she didn't want attention. The boardroom had glass panels on either side of the main door. She could see inside without approaching the door. A long table, 6 people seated, a 7th standing near the window with his back to the room. She didn't know Warren Gall by sight, but the man at the window had the body language of someone who was performing calm while calculating furiously, and when he turned slightly to respond to something someone at the table said, she saw his face. 60, maybe 62. Silver temples, good suit. The face of a man who had spent his career being the person in the room who understood the numbers better than everyone else and had quietly, consistently used that advantage. He was looking at his phone, Then he looked up. Through the glass panel, directly at her, their eyes met for 2 seconds. She watched his face do the same thing Metz's had done in the lobby that morning. The rapid processing of a situation that had shifted past the point where he controlled it. Except Gall was smarter than Metz, which made the processing faster and the conclusion he reached different. He moved toward the boardroom door. She stepped back and to the side of the corridor. Behind her, she heard the stairwell door open, and she looked. 2 of Pruitt's agents coming through fast, Denning behind them. She pointed at the boardroom door with one hand and got out of their way. The boardroom door opened. Gall stepped into the corridor and found agents on both sides of him. He was good. She had to give him that. He didn't run, didn't shout, didn't do the thing people do on television where they make it worse by performing a scene. He looked at the agents, looked at Denning, looked briefly at Nora, and she saw in his face the specific calculation of a man who had already decided that the best remaining move was to say nothing at all. "Warren Gall," Denning said, "I have a warrant for your arrest. Federal fraud, conspiracy, and misappropriation of federally designated veteran healthcare funds." Gall said, "I'd like my attorney." "You'll have that opportunity." The agents moved in. The board members who'd been seated inside the room were now clustered at the glass panels, watching with the stunned stillness of people who had come to an emergency meeting about a COO's arrest and were now watching a board member go out in handcuffs. Gall walked with the agents without resistance. As they passed Nora in the corridor, he looked at her once more, not with contempt this time, not with fear, with something that was closer to assessment, the look of someone cataloging how they'd been caught and where the chain had broken. She didn't say anything. There was nothing she needed to say to him. Denning stopped beside her as the agents moved Gall toward the elevator. "Cross gave us 3 names," he said quietly. "The 4th one, I know, I got lucky thinking about timing." "It wasn't luck." He said it flatly, which was the most convincing way he could have said it. That was 6 years of financial architecture identified in about 4 minutes by someone who'd been awake for 2 days. She was too tired to deflect it gracefully, so she just nodded. "What happens to the board now?" she said. "The remaining members will conduct an emergency governance review. The board's legal counsel will have recommendations by end of week. There'll be an interim period before they rebuild." He paused. "The hospital itself isn't implicated in the sense of the institution being at fault. It was the people controlling the administrative structure. With those people removed, Callaway Ridge continues operating. The veteran care programs will be reviewed, restored, properly funded." He said it with the specificity of a man who was already thinking about the paperwork involved in making sure of it. Cross's documentation in the jacket lining was 5 years of that program's real expenditure versus what was reported. It's going to take a forensic accounting team several months to trace it all, but the headline number will be confirmed. The money will be pursued. She thought about $4 million of money meant for veterans' health care that had moved sideways through billing records and compliant administrators and a compliance consultant who had designed the exploit himself. Thought about what $4 million meant in terms of actual care, medication, treatment hours, procedures not done because funds weren't there. "Some of those veterans aren't alive to see it resolved," she said. "No," Denning said. "They're not." The corridor was quiet between them for a moment. "The suspension," he said. "We'll submit a formal letter to the board today regarding your role in this matter and our recommendation for immediate reinstatement. Combined with Adara's request, I'd expect action by tomorrow." "What about the staff Metz pressured into signing?" "That's more complicated. The statements he collected were coercive enough in some cases that the signers may have protections as cooperative witnesses. It'll be individual. Sandra Polk's situation is straightforward. She didn't sign, and she called the tip line. There are others who didn't sign who will need protection. We'll work through them." She nodded. Looked down the corridor toward where the agents had taken Gall. The elevator doors had closed. He was gone in the same direction Metz had gone 4 hours earlier, through a building that no longer held the shape they'd built it into. Her phone buzzed. "Farouk. Cross is out of surgery. Recovery is going to be slow. He's asking for a federal agent, says he wants to finish his statement. Also, he asked for you by name." She read it twice. Then she texted back, "I'll be up in 10 minutes. She started for the elevator, then stopped. Went to the window at the end of the corridor instead. From the second floor, she could see the parking approach and the visitor lot below. 47 motorcycles still there. The news cameras still working. Bernard Thiel visible near the front, talking to a reporter, using, she was certain, the exact words she'd suggested. One of the riders near the back had a hand-lettered sign, just cardboard and marker, propped on his bike. It said, "We don't forget our own." She stood there for a moment with the October light coming flat through the window and felt the weight of the last 48 hours trying to land all at once. The suspension, Dillard's forearm, the library terminal, Cross's grip on her wrist in the corridor. Don't let them. She was a suspended nurse who had walked into a hospital as a private citizen and ended up in the middle of the most consequential day this building had seen in its 30-year history. She had a reinstatement request in process, a criminal investigation that had just netted 4 people, and a post-operative patient on the 4th floor who had discharged himself from military care and traveled 90 miles with a surgical wound because he had one more name to give and apparently needed to get here to do it. She had questions she hadn't asked yet. About why Cross had asked for her by name, about what Denning had meant when he said the 4th name changed the geometry, about whether the accounting of what had been stolen would ever translate into what had been lost. She pressed her hand flat against the window glass for a moment, cold, solid, the simple weight of a real object. Then she turned away from it and walked to the elevator. When the doors opened on the 4th floor and she stepped out into the recovery corridor, a young nurse she'd never seen before was at the station. He looked up, looked at her ID badge, which still had her photo, her name, her department, even though the suspension was still technically active. He started to say something about visiting hours. She was already walking. "I'm expected," she said, and 3 rooms down, behind a closed door with a chart hanging on the outside that had a name on it she hadn't known 4 days ago, Eldon Cross was waiting to finish what he'd started. With a story that wasn't over, and a final piece of it that only he and one other person in the world knew, and that other person had been very carefully invisible for 6 years. Until now. She pushed open the door. The room was small and overlit the way hospital rooms always were, the afternoon light coming through a partially closed blind and mixing badly with the fluorescent overhead. Eldon Cross was in the bed with the particular stillness of a man who had used up most of what he had and was now conserving what remained. He was connected to a monitor, an IV running into his left arm, the incision site from the 3rd procedure covered and dressed. He looked smaller than he had in the corridor. Not diminished exactly, but compressed, the way people look when pain has moved in and taken up permanent residence. Pruitt was already in the room, seated in the chair beside the bed. She looked up when Nora came in and moved the chair slightly to make space without being asked. Cross opened his eyes. They were brown, fully tracking, and sharper than they had any right to be given what his body had been through in the last 3 days. He looked at Nora for a moment with the assessing steadiness of someone who had been told about her and was confirming whether the account was accurate. "You're the one who found me in the corridor," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation but controlled. "Yes. 3rd time you've kept me breathing." She pulled a second chair up without ceremony and sat down. "I'm not sure the math on that holds up." "It does." He said it without making it sentimental. Just fact. "In Kunar Province, 2009, forward base. I was the logistics officer, not a combat role, but the vehicle I was in hit something on the road. I lost a lot of blood. The medic who worked me was young, 23, 24. She did it right. Didn't panic, didn't waste time. I made it out." He looked at her steadily. "I pulled your service record after you admitted me. Your deployment timeline matches." She sat with that for a moment. She had treated so many people in Kunar. She had no memory of his face. There had been no reason to hold a logistics officer's face the way you held other things from that period. But she believed him. The math was right, and the look on his face was not the look of someone constructing something. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't." He moved his hand slightly, a gesture that encompassed the bed, the room, the building around them. "That's the point." Pruitt leaned forward. "Eldon, the name. We have Gall in custody, but we need you to confirm it on the record." And Cross looked at her, then back at Nora. "Warren Gall ran the compliance audit 6 years ago," he said. I was still working for the outreach program then. I saw the audit report. It was thorough, better than most. I remember thinking whoever wrote it understood our billing structure better than the people who built it. He paused to breathe, measured and deliberate. 3 months later, the irregularities started. Small at first. I thought it was data entry. By the time I understood what I was looking at, it had been running for a year and a half. How did Gall connect to Metz? Through the board appointment, Gall recommended Metz for the COO position to the previous board chair. That's in the meeting minutes if you dig back far enough. He put his person inside the building, gave him the blueprint from the audit, and they ran it together. Gall handled the financial architecture from outside. Metz handled the internal controls. Dillard handled anyone who got too close. He stopped. Soul, Gary Soul, was the account. The place the money landed before it moved again. A shell-holding structure Gall had been using for other things for 20 years. Pruitt was recording. She'd started the moment Cross began speaking, with his consent, with Richter present at the door as witness. The statement was formal, and it was going to hold. The documents in the jacket, Nora said. 5 years of my own records. I kept parallel books from the moment I understood what was happening, copied billing documents when I could access them, kept ledger entries of what the program actually spent versus what was reported. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. I knew if I brought it without evidence, I'd be told I was wrong, so I spent 2 years building the evidence before I went to anyone. Why not go to federal investigators immediately? I tried. First contact was 18 months ago. It took 8 months to get to someone who believed me enough to open a file. He said it without bitterness, just the specific weariness of someone who had pushed against bureaucratic weight for long enough that they no longer expected it to move easily. By then, Dillard had already found out I was talking. The harassment started. I kept moving, tried to stay in the protection arrangement, but he stopped. I should have trusted it more. Leaving was a mistake. Why did you leave? Cross looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not quite embarrassment, but the acknowledgement of an imperfect decision made under pressure. I was told Cross's documentation had been obtained by the other side, that whatever I was holding was already known. Someone called the protection line, knew details they shouldn't have known, and He exhaled. I ran. Old instinct. In the field, when you've been compromised, you move. It was the wrong call for this situation. Someone called the line to flush you out, Pruitt said. We think it was Gall. He had enough contact with the Marshal's administrative system through his compliance work over the years to know how to mimic the format. Cross nodded once. I figured that out about 6 hours after I was already on a bus. He said it with the dark, dry acknowledgement of a man who had catalogued his own error and moved past punishing himself for it. Pruitt looked at Nora. Something in her expression said enough for now, and also thank you simultaneously, which was an efficient use of a look. Nora stood. Get some sleep, she told Cross. In a minute. He looked up at her. I read your suspension paperwork, the grounds Metz used. It doesn't matter now. It matters to me. He called you insubordinate and a habitual violator of resource protocols. He said you had a pattern of prioritizing personal judgment over institutional procedure. He held her gaze. He meant it as an indictment. You should wear it as a credential. She stood in the overlit room with the October light bleeding through the blind and looked at this man who had sewn 5 years of evidence into a jacket lining and ridden a bus into a city where one person had been willing to admit him without checking his insurance first, and she didn't have anything to say that was equal to the moment, so she just nodded, and she left him to sleep. The next 72 hours were not clean or simple, because nothing real ever was. The federal investigation's public phase moved fast once the arrests were processed. Warren Gall's attorney issued a statement within hours claiming his client would be cooperating fully, which Pruitt said privately meant Gall had done the math and understood that the forensic accounting trail was complete enough to bury him and cooperation was his only remaining currency. Gary Soul, the financial intermediary, began talking within 24 hours of his arrest in Laramie. The shell holding structure through which the money had moved began unraveling within 48 hours, a chain of accounts spanning 3 states in 6 years. all of it traceable once investigators had Cross's parallel ledgers to map against the official records. Harlan Metz hired an attorney who specialized in white-collar defense and said nothing publicly. Craig Dillard made the opposite choice. He gave a statement to investigators within the first day that attempted to position him as a low-level participant who had been following instructions, which might have been more effective if 3 separate veterans hadn't come forward within the week to document incidents of harassment and false arrest that Dillard had conducted over the previous 4 years. The body camera footage from those incidents had been selectively deleted, which became an additional charge. The board of directors of Callaway Ridge Medical Center convened an emergency session within 36 hours of the arrests. Warren Gall's seat was vacated. An independent interim administrator was appointed. Doctor. Adara's formal complaint and Denning's letter regarding Nora's role arrived simultaneously, and the board, now operating under the specific urgency of an institution trying to demonstrate it understood what had happened, moved on the reinstatement question within the same session. She got the call on the 3rd morning. The interim administrator, a woman named Ruth Farwell, who had the brisk manner of someone brought in to do difficult things efficiently, told her the suspension had been voided, her record cleared, and her position reinstated with back pay for the period of suspension. "We'd also like to discuss a formal role," Farwell said, "a leadership position in veteran care services that the board believes should have existed at this hospital long before now." Nora was sitting in Jazz's kitchen when the call came. She said, "I'll come in and talk. We can arrange it whenever you're ready." "Tomorrow," she said. She hung up. Jazz was at the counter making coffee and had been carefully not looking at her during the call. "Well?" Jazz said. Reinstated, Jazz set down the coffee pot and turned around. Her expression was the particular one of a person who had been holding worry at a controlled distance for 3 days and was now releasing it. "About time. They want me in a director role, veteran care services." "Are you going to take it?" Nora looked at the table. The piece of paper she'd written her list on 3 days ago was still there, folded twice, sitting near the edge. What she knew, what she needed, what she could do. "Yes," she said, "on my conditions." Jazz smiled, which was not something she did often enough. "Obviously." 2 weeks later. The press conference was not something Nora had asked for or particularly wanted, but Denning had explained that it was necessary. The public dimension of the investigation required a public accounting, and the people who'd been harmed by the diverted funds deserved to see the resolution stated plainly rather than buried in court filings. She understood the logic. She didn't love being part of the staging. She stood to one side of the cluster of officials and investigators as Denning gave the formal statement. The numbers were bigger than the initial estimate. The forensic accounting had landed at $5.2 million, diverted over 6 years from veteran healthcare grants across a 5-county region. 14 programs had been underfunded as a direct result. The specific human consequences were harder to quantify. People who had not received care they were entitled to, who had navigated a system that was failing them without knowing the failure was deliberate. Pruitt stood on the other side of the cluster, watching the cameras with the same controlled expression she'd worn through the entire week. She'd told Nora the day before that the Gall investigation had opened 3 connected threads in 2 adjacent counties, that the scheme was part of a broader pattern Gall had been running for closer to a decade in various forms. It was going to be a long case. She seemed, if not satisfied, then at least purposefully oriented, which Nora recognized as the version of okay that people in that line of work usually got. Eldon Cross was in the room. He was in a wheelchair. 10 days post-splenectomy was not a standing-at-podium situation, pushed by a young Army corpsman who had been assigned as his escort for the event. He'd gained some color back. He was wearing civilian clothes, a dark jacket, and he looked like a man who had decided that the remaining time he had was going to be spent in a specific way and had made peace with that decision. When Denning finished the formal statement and opened for questions, a reporter asked about the nursing staff member who had first identified Cross as a patient in need and refused to be pressured out of the situation. Denning said, "Nora Vass served 6 years as an Army combat medic before transitioning to civilian nursing. Her service record includes 2 overseas deployments and a commendation for performance under fire. At Callaway Ridge, She identified an emergency case that others attempted to redirect for financial reasons, maintained her professional and ethical judgment under institutional pressure, documented critical information at personal risk, and ultimately provided emergency intervention when a key federal witness presented in crisis in the hospital corridor. She was suspended for doing all of that. She has since been reinstated. He paused. The resolution of this investigation is attributable to a number of people. She's near the top of that list. Nora looked at the floor. Not from embarrassment, from the specific discomfort of being described accurately in a room full of cameras. She'd been described inaccurately in institutional documents, in suspension paperwork, in a COO's carefully worded dismissal. Having it be accurate was its own kind of adjustment. Cross caught her eye from his wheelchair. He gave her a single, small nod. She returned it. After the formal portion in the corridor outside the press room, Denning found her. "The Director of Veteran Care Services role," he said. "Farwell told me you accepted. With conditions." "She told me that too. What were they?" "No veteran presenting at Callaway Ridge gets redirected for financial screening before emergency assessment. Ever. That gets written into policy, not just practice. And the program gets real funding with real oversight, not a budget line that can be quietly eroded." She met his eyes. "If those two things are in place, the role is worth taking. If they're not, I'm a staff nurse, and I do the same work from a different desk." "Those seem like reasonable conditions." "I know." Farwell agreed. So did the board. She paused. "The funding, some of the recovered money, the portion that can be redirected back to the programs that were originally intended to receive it, I want that tied to the veteran care program at Callaway Ridge and the 4 other programs in the region that were underfunded, formally. So there's a legal obligation, not just an intention. That's a conversation for the federal attorneys managing the asset recovery, but it's not an unreasonable ask." He said it in a way that meant he was going to make it happen. She nodded. They stood in the corridor for a moment, the noise of the press conference breaking up on the other side of the wall. "You knew," she said, "when you called me that first night. You'd seen my service record. You knew Cross's connection to the 2009 Kunar deployment. You knew there was a chance I'd treated him before." Denning was quiet for a moment. "I knew it was possible. I didn't know it was certain. Did it change how you thought about involving me?" "It confirmed that you were someone who understood what was at stake beyond the institutional politics." He held her gaze. "It didn't create an obligation. You made your own choices." "I know," she said. "I'm not objecting to it. I just wanted to understand the full picture." He allowed a slight, brief expression that was as close to a smile as he seemed to operate. "That's a very you thing to want." She was going to say something back to that, but Cross's corpsman wheeled him around the corner just then, and Cross himself looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting to say something privately and was taking the opportunity. "Ms. Vass," he said. "Or I suppose I should start saying Director Vass." "Not yet." "Soon." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to understand was just how he operated. No performative warmth, no sentiment in the delivery, but something genuine underneath the plain surface of it. "I've been thinking about what to say to you for 10 days. Everything I've come up with sounds either too small or too large." "Then don't say it." "I'm going to anyway." He paused. "You didn't know me. You didn't know what I carried or what it meant. You just saw a man who needed help and you helped him. And then when they punished you for it, you didn't fold. You didn't pretend it was acceptable. You kept moving." He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up. "That's rarer than people think. I've seen what people do under institutional pressure. Most of them bend. Not because they're cowards, because the system is designed to make bending feel like the rational choice." He held her gaze. "You weren't rational. You were right. Those aren't always the same thing." She stood in the corridor outside a press room where her name had just been spoken correctly into cameras for the first time, and looked at this man who had spent 2 years building evidence alone and 6 months in and out of protective custody and 3 surgical procedures in 4 days, and she thought about what he'd said. Not rational. Right. She'd known the difference since she was 23 years old on a forward base in Kunar province, working in a space the size of a closet with inadequate supplies, and a patient who statistically should not have made it. The rational thing, the protected thing, the thing that minimized personal exposure, that was never the thing that mattered when the moment came down to its actual components. The thing that mattered was what you could actually do, and whether you were willing to do it. She'd never stopped being that 23-year-old in the moments that counted. She wasn't sure if that was a limitation or the most useful thing about her. Probably both. Take care of yourself, she told Cross. Actually take care of yourself, not the version where you discharge from a military facility and ride 90 miles post-op. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. That was a lapse in judgment. It was a disaster in judgment. Don't do it again. I'll try. Try harder. He laughed, short, real, the laugh of a man who hadn't done it in a while and found it used muscles that were sore. Then he composed himself, because it hurt, and looked at her one final time with that quiet, calibrated steadiness. Go do the job, he said. She started the Monday after. Her office was small and faced the parking structure, which was not a view anyone would have chosen, but it was hers. And the morning she sat in it for the first time, she put the framed photo from her old locker on the desk and her coffee on the left side and opened the Veteran Care Program's existing documentation on the right. The documentation was thin. Underfunded for 6 years, its paper trail reflected the skeleton of a program that should have been 10 times its actual size. Patient records sparse, referral pathways incomplete, no formal intake protocol for veteran-specific presentations, no coordination with regional outreach organizations. She made a new list. What she knew, what she needed, what she could actually do. The list was long. The work was going to be slow and imperfect and frequently frustrating. There would be bureaucratic walls and budget arguments, and days when the infrastructure resisted her the way it had always resisted people who asked it to work correctly for the people it was supposed to serve. She knew this. She wasn't building an illusion. She was building something real, which meant it would be difficult, uneven, and occasionally ugly. It also meant it would last. Down in the parking structure, she could see Bernard Thiel's truck sitting in the visitor lot. He'd come to the Monday morning session she'd set up with the regional veterans outreach coordinators. The first formal meeting between Callaway Ridge's Veteran Care Program and the community organizations it was supposed to serve, something that apparently had never happened in the program's history. Thiel had brought 2 other writers with him. They were going to sit at the table and tell her what the program had been failing to provide, in specific terms, from the perspective of people who'd been navigating the failure. She'd asked for that meeting deliberately. Not because it was going to be comfortable, it wasn't, but because the only way to build something that actually worked was to start with the honest accounting of what hadn't. Her phone buzzed. Pruitt. Gall took a plea. 12 years, full cooperation on connected cases, full asset forfeiture. Formal announcement this afternoon. She read it twice. 12 years for a man who had spent a decade designing systems to steal from sick veterans. It was not everything. It was not the full weight of what $5.2 million meant in terms of care withheld and lives made harder, and people who had served and come home to a system that was supposed to help them and instead had quietly stolen from them. It was what the law could do with what they had. She understood the difference between that and justice in the absolute sense. She'd understood it since the first time she'd watched a situation resolve in the way situations actually resolved, partially, messily, with some things recovered and some things permanently lost. She wrote back, "Good." Then she put the phone down, picked up her coffee, looked at the thin file of the Veteran Care Program she was going to rebuild from the ground up, and got to work. Outside, the October air was cold and clear, and the mountains above Danner Falls were already carrying the first edge of snow on their upper faces. Somewhere on Route 9, probably, there were motorcycles. There were always motorcycles on Route 9 if you paid attention. Most of them were just people going somewhere. Some of them were people who had decided that being visible, present, insistent, accounted for, was the most necessary thing they could do. Nora Vass had spent 3 years at Callaway Ridge being exactly as visible as she needed to be to do her job and no more. She'd been quiet about what she'd done and where she'd been and what she knew. It had made her easy to dismiss. There was a lesson in that. Not the lesson that you should make yourself loud or perform your history for the benefit of people who needed to understand your authority. The lesson was simpler and harder than that. The lesson was that institutions are not neutral. They are built by people with interests, and they serve those interests first. And the work of making them serve everyone else is never finished, and is never clean, and is never done by people who are waiting for permission. She had never waited for permission. She had just, for a time, been willing to do the work quietly enough that the people protecting the wrong interests didn't notice until it was too late to stop her. They'd noticed eventually. They'd suspended her. They'd tried to build a paper wall around what she knew. She'd kept moving. That was the whole thing, really. Not the commendation or the director's title or the press conference or Eldon Cross telling her she'd done something rare. Those things were real, and she would carry them without apology. But the thing underneath all of it, the thing she'd known since a forward base in Kunar province with insufficient supplies and a patient who should have died and didn't, was simply this. You keep moving. You do the next right thing with the tools you have in the space you're standing in, and you part one don't wait for the moment to be easier, or the authorization to be clear, or the institution to acknowledge that you're correct. You just do it. And sometimes, if the thing you're doing is important enough, and the people around you are brave enough, the rest of the world catches up. She turned to the first page of the program file and began to read.